I saved literally thousands of dollars while building my home studio, and not only building my home studio, but adapting half of the house for some kind of audio purpose. And you can do that as well. It's actually super simple. Everything that you need is the knowledge not to make the common mistakes and not to waste money on products that are marketed as a solution to your problem when they're actually not. So I'm going to share with you 8 fundamentals for beginner home studio recording with DIY solutions that have helped me save a lot of money, raise the quality of my work, and develop the confidence in my work. If you don't know who I am, my name is Marco, and I just recently started my YouTube channel. I used to be an actively gigging musician and engineer on a cruise ship, but my lifelong dedication is to sound engineering. Like most of you, I started out from nothing, and I had to find solutions to get what I want for the least amount of money invested. Just recently, I started a Slightly Technical Academy, which you can visit at slightlytechnicalacademy.com, and I encourage you to register over there because it's free and you get access to our private backstage server on Discord, where we can actually hang and you can ask questions and I can provide you with actual support. On the Academy, I have many goodies for guitar players. There's the tech pages, and please go check out my course on the Big Muff Pi, which is a ridiculous course, which is 14 hours long, and I teach audio electronics through dissecting a legendary pedal. So you don't only learn how to build a pedal, you get ridiculous fundamentals of knowledge over there for audio engineering, and it was designed for beginners in mind. Oh, and do not forget to connect with me on Instagram. Now, fundamental number 1 is probably the most obvious one to start off with, and it's probably the most extensively discussed on the internet, especially when it comes to DIY solutions on a budget, and that is acoustic treatment on a budget. So you're going to start your home studio, you've got your room, you need to do some kind of acoustic treatment. Now, if you are a beginner, I can completely understand that you are quite confused because in 2025, when you open the internet, when you start typing acoustic treatment on a budget on YouTube, you are going to be blasted with a lot of videos that are going to be, well, some of them are going to be selling you some things. Some other videos are going to be teaching you how to do the right thing. The problem is there's a lot of information and it's quite confusing and there are a lot of conflicting opinions, all right? So let me break it down for you, at least fundamentally, and I want to let you know what are the things to pay attention to, what are the common pitfalls, and how you can evade making the most common mistakes, at least the mistakes that I see people do, all right? So I always suggest learning at least a little bit of acoustics and psychoacoustics. It is a fun thing, it is a fun read, but you don't really need to read some books, you don't really need to become an expert, an academic in acoustics or psychoacoustics. Here's ChatGPT. In today's day and age, you can get information that is basically chewed up for you and you can just swallow it. Just go and start chatting with ChatGPT. You're going to get mostly correct information on this topic, and you would learn that when sound enters a room or when sound is actually reproduced in a certain room, a few things are going to happen to these sound waves. They're going to get reflected, they're going to get diffused, they're going to get absorbed. And fundamentally, the mistake that I see people do usually when they start doing any kind of acoustic treatment to a room is that they start searching for the treatment before doing a correct analysis. And if you've been studying psychoacoustics and acoustics, well, everybody's going to tell you, every book is going to say that first you need to analyze what is the problem. Now, the first thing that you can do to a room is you can measure it. That is super easy because you'd be surprised how much information you can get just from measuring the width, height, and length of a room, because you are going to find out which frequencies are going to get amplified and which frequencies are going to get sort of like dipped. So you're going to get some notches, especially in small rooms. Certain frequencies can be really problematic, but this kind of knowledge is going to give you the right information on what kind of treatment you need. So after you figure out these so-called modes of your room, you can decide, all right, so these are the problematic frequencies and this is what I need to do to my room. Now, I would say that in over 90% of the cases, you would need mostly absorption in your room. You would need to create absorption panels. Now, one solution is to go and buy some absorption panels. People have been selling a lot of different materials and they absorb. If you look at these specifics and data sheets, you would see that they absorb all the way to I don't know how low a frequency, but that is simply not true for a lot of the products that at least I've seen, and there are great DIY solutions for this. I saved tons of money just by doing DIY absorption panels because you can buy the material. If you have a small workshop or if you have a friend that can cut some wood for you, you can assemble a few fat, like thick acoustic panels that are going to do wonders for your home studio room. In general, you don't want to dampen the room too much, but you need a lot of absorption because these absorption panels, the thicker they are, and if you just move them just a little bit away from the wall, the lower the frequency that they're going to be absorbing. So when you start absorbing these low frequencies, you're going to start having a controlled room. After doing that, you can move on to working on the different frequency spectrums because acoustic treatment is not that simple. But realistically, if you're building a home studio, you need to get somewhat good results. You don't need to create a room that is going to be, recording some experimental stuff, measurement stuff. So you don't want to completely dampen the room. You just need a good sounding room. You don't want like weird reflections. You don't want stuff to sound simply bad. You want to hear, especially the low end and the low mids, you want to hear them without any bad dips. And this is what you have to do. You want to learn about the dimensions of the room and you want to add a lot of absorption. After you've added absorption, you can work with the foam that you can see up on the wall back there. Well, let's be honest, that foam doesn't do a lot. That foam only works on higher frequencies. We're talking like higher mids and stuff like that. And you would add the foam only after you've done the absorption part, because when you have a controlled bass, then you can work with the foam. And the foam is going to help with some of the slap back. It's going to simply clean out some of the higher frequencies. That is the stuff that is the next level. All right. So next thing that we need to mention is diffusion. Diffusion is usually connected to those very, very nice panels, sometimes made out of wood, very nice shapes. You've seen this stuff in the studio. And basically diffusion is there to kind of break the sound wave and diffuse it so it doesn't reflect. So it's not basically absorbing it, but it's also going to break these reflections. Diffusion is super, super useful, but you don't really need to build those panels and you don't really need to buy them. Sometimes they're quite expensive. Now, to make good diffusion, you don't want empty walls. You want to put something on the walls, and you want to put something that is going to, well, basically change the shape of the wall. And the bigger the change in the shape, well, let's just say that the different frequencies that are going to be affected. Now, what would be a DI solution for this? Well, you can make bookshelves. If you have any books in your house, if you have anything that you can put on your walls, and bookshelves are just perfect. And it's a perfect DIY solution where you can fill your room up with stuff. Just put stuff on the walls, and that is going to do wonders with the diffusion. And you're going to spend literally $0 because you don't need to buy anything. You can just work with stuff that you already have. And not only that, you are not going to have these diffusion panels, which, well, sometimes they look good, but sometimes they don't really look good. You will create a studio that feels like home, which is in many cases much more important than just having like really, really proper acoustic treatment, professional or whatnot. So a few things that I want to mention when we're talking about acoustic treatment, and that is that most beginner home studios, the problem that I had, and I'm sure that a lot of people have, is that we want to make a studio in a small room. Now, small rooms, when it comes to audio, are really, really problematic because, well, in small rooms, you don't have the liberty to move stuff around. And also small rooms resonate on really ugly frequencies, let's call it like that. So you need to pay attention when you're working in a small room. You need to add quite a lot of absorption to, just calm that bass down. That is at least my suggestion. You will not have that much problem with doing the diffusion because you would only need one bookshelf or two or some stuff on the wall. So that is not so much problematic. But control the bass in a small room, and also do not expect that you are going to be having any frequencies less than like 30 hertz. A lot of people put very, very big speakers in small rooms, so do not put like extremely big speakers in small rooms. Sometimes you don't really need a subwoofer. And the reality is that the room is actually smaller than the actual wavelength of the frequencies that you're trying to reproduce. So it is literally impossible to hear these frequencies and feel them in this actual room. It is going to be felt by your neighbors, not so much by you. So do not expect that you're going to have a lot of like extreme low end in small rooms. You will simply have to find different ways around that problem. So basically, before we start off with the next topic, which is going to be simply a continuation of this pretty much, we need to sort of realize what is the takeaway from all this story. So the whole point is that with creativity and understanding, you can go from a very bad sounding room to a wonderful sounding room, and you don't need a lot of money to do that. Now, moving on to the second topic. The second topic is kind of connected to the first one, and that is the knowledge of speaker placement and the knowledge of the listening position. That is also kind of connected to the acoustics and psychoacoustic talk and to the acoustic treatment. But realistically, when you create your listening room in your small home studio, you need to pick a place where you're going to place your speakers, some kind of studio monitors that you're going to be using, and where are you going to be listening. Based on that, you are going to create the acoustic treatment, because realistically, the only place where the acoustic treatment needs to be working perfectly is in this spot. Well, it's not really this spot in my room, but realistically, the spot where you are actually listening. So here are a few things. All right, we need to break this down. It's quite complicated, but the first thing that you need to pay attention to are the early reflections. You need to understand that when you are listening in a certain position, so I'm sitting here listening to my monitors, I'm not only hearing the direct sound coming from the monitors to my ears, I'm actually hearing the reflections that are happening around them. So the general idea is that you want to have these monitors in a position so the reflections are coming at the same time. That means that you want these monitors to be equidistant from the walls on the sides. That is really important, and sometimes it is not achievable, especially in DIY home studios, that a lot of us, we simply have to deal with some problems that are not present otherwise. If you're building a dedicated home studio, if you're building a dedicated professional studio, a dedicated building, sometimes we just need to adapt a room. So what happens if you cannot really put the monitors exactly in the center so you would have these controlled early reflections? Sometimes you can do this compensation in software, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. So when you're setting up the monitors, and I'm talking about monitors as being the primary listening way, all right? Even though we can listen to like headphones, and we're going to talk about headphones in a bit, when you set these monitors up, you want to pay attention how distant they are from the sidewalls. We already talked about it, and we also want to pay attention that they are not directly close to the wall in the back. And you also want some space behind the listening position, or actually where the monitors are directed. In general, you want to create a triangle where the monitors are slightly tilted. You would want the tweeters in general to be around the height of your ears, even though there are a lot of conflicting opinions about this. I would not say that this is crucial, but you want to put the monitors a little bit further away from the back wall. That's going to help a lot. And I don't want to get into like all the details when it comes to like how distant the monitors should be in the room. There are a lot of different opinions on this, and especially if you go into the audiophile and hi-fi world, they talk about this stuff a lot. And if you're interested, for sure, I encourage you to go and find out more. But realistically, sometimes we can't put the monitors further away from the back wall. So what can we do? Well, a moment ago, I suggested a software solution. There is a software, and I'm not by any means sponsored by this company or anything. There is just a phenomenal software that is called Reference, Sound ID Reference. Now, if you go and check out this software, basically what it does is it creates some kind of equalizer that balances out your speakers, equalizes them, adds well, it can change different things in the speakers based on a measurement that you create with a calibration microphone. Now, a calibration microphone is something that is not really expensive. There is a Behringer one that costs around about $50, or you can lend it from someone. Usually people in studios and also live sound engineers, they would have this calibration microphone. You can calibrate your room and you can use this software basically to equalize your room to be, well, not really flat, but as flat as possible. And you would do this after you finish positioning yourself and after you do the acoustic treatment. So after everything is done, you would want to calibrate your room. This is going to help a lot because this will compensate for the reflections. This is going to compensate for the actual monitors. This is going to compensate for a lot of things, and it's going to enable you to have almost fully pro level sound in your small home studio, at least as close as it can possibly be. And this is no secret. People have been doing this in pro studios since a long time. Even before this software was available, people were simply using external equalizers. They would use pink noise, for example, and then they would equalize to basically remove the problems of their room. That's how they treat these modes, like the frequencies where the amplitudes are going to grow rapidly because of the dimensions of the room. And that's how they fix these notches, so the frequencies that are missing in the room, and you are going to get a much better sounding simply audio image after you complete all this, even if you don't have the right conditions to have one. Well, I also said that there is a different solution, and that solution is using headphones. Now, headphones are absolutely amazing. I use a pair of headphones. I always check stuff on a pair of headphones, and that's also good. Since we mentioned the Sound ID reference, you can actually download the files for the particular model of your headphones and input it into the Sound ID reference application. Basically, it is going to flatten out your headphones. For me, this is a no-brainer. For me, this is something that I actually suggest you pay for because it really, really helps a lot with the listening. You can go ahead and buy ridiculously expensive headphones, but I don't really suggest that. I suggest you buy good headphones. I suggest you buy comfortable headphones, and I suggest you buy headphones that do have a calibration file for the Sound ID reference. You can flatten them out because it is going to compensate basically for the imperfections of these headphones, enabling you to actually hear a more flat sound so you can be more surgical about whatever you are doing. Now, there is a DIY solution for monitors that I wanted to mention in this section before we move on to the next one, and that is monitor stands. Now, monitor stands can sometimes be ridiculously expensive, and I suggest creating your own monitor stands because you would be ridiculously surprised how good you can make them for basically like a negligible amount of money, because everything that you need is essentially pipes. You can make them very thick. You can fill them up with sand, and you can create, it really depends on what kind of setup of your monitors you have. Sometimes you want floor stands, right? If you have floor stands, you would need some pipes. You can make a foundation from concrete or from metal. You can fix it to the ground. You can actually make these pipes and fill them with sand. So the heavier they are, the more stable they're going to be. And that is the general idea. Even when you go and buy a monitor stand, you will soon figure out that not all of them are that good. They cost a lot of money, but they're not that heavy. You can make much heavier ones, much more stable ones that are going to work just fine for your home studio. And that is not to say that there are no good products out there on the market. That is not to say that these DIY solutions are absolutely perfect. I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of resources on the internet that you can go and you can watch and learn how you can actually build this stuff by yourself. But we're talking about a home studio, we're talking about beginners, and we're talking about a solution for a problem. And that solution is going to bring you like 95% there. And sometimes 95% there is absolutely the best solution that you can possibly get to for the least amount of money. So there is no need to have perfect stuff. You do not need to be afraid and You see, there are a lot of people who talk about this kind of stuff where they say that you need this, where you don't need it. You don't need it necessarily. You just need a solution that is going to work for you. And I'll give you an example that I use in my room because I had all the problems that you can possibly have if you want to create a listening room. It is small. I have no space to move the monitors further away from the wall, so I need to do some heavy equalization to make the sound at least bearable. It's a disaster, but it's what I had to work with. But when it comes to the stand, well, wall mounts were quite expensive for the studio monitors, but you know what was not expensive? Well, a wall mount for a TV. A ridiculously cheap thing. I think I bought them for like $10 or $15 or something like that. And I just modified them slightly. I made a nice platform, like a foundation for the monitor, and I used these wall mounts because they can carry much greater weights than the studio monitors, so that is not the problem. And not only that I got wall mounts that were perfect for my studio monitors, but I actually got something that's also movable. So I can actually adjust them really, really well. So there are a lot of different DIY solutions, and this is one that I think can save you a lot of money, and you don't really have to work a lot for it. All right, so moving on to the third fundamental that I want to talk about here, and that is cables and connectors. So here's the thing. If you have a home studio, I suggest you learn how to solder. Soldering skills are not hard at all. And you can save a lot of money by creating different adapters and creating different cables for your home studio. And I do suggest creating your own cables because not only that you will save a lot of money, but you can actually create cables of custom lengths, so exact lengths that you need in your home studio, which is yet again not only going to be a solution so you use less cable and therefore save some money, it is also going to be a solution to achieve lower noise floor. These cables are not going to be moving around the room, picking up different kinds of interference around the room. You will have cables that of the exact length that you need to connect the devices that you're connecting, and that is a perfect solution. Most pro studio people, they make their own cables, believe it or not. You can get really high quality cables, high quality adapters, and you can create them by yourself. It doesn't take a lot of time, and it's also fun. Let me tell you something. For me, one of the most fun things to do is soldering because I can switch my brains off. I can, play a podcast, and maybe you are now listening to me blabber about this stuff and you're soldering. That is one of the best solutions. It is like meditation. So I completely suggest you start soldering and make your own cables and connectors. Another thing that is really important when you have a home studio is to create your own adapters. When I say adapters, well, sometimes you need weird cables, and these weird cables can only be made because you don't really have solutions on the market, or the solutions on the market are quite expensive. Sometimes you need adapters. Like, for example, you have a cable, it's on one side, it's an XLR, on the other side is going to be a 6.3 millimeter jack. A very frequent necessity, for example, if you're connecting your audio interface to your speakers, that is something that I definitely suggest you make by yourself because you're going to save a lot of money and it's going to be absolutely great. In addition to that, you can label your cables. You can use heat shrink to make them like really, really nice. And everything that you need to do is just to learn how to solder. You've got all the diagrams on the internet. There's a lot of solutions for this. So just don't be afraid of it. I've seen a lot of people being afraid of the soldering iron. People have been even bringing me like, can you make this cable for me? Like, why can't you make a cable? A soldering iron is only $10, a good one that you can actually use for this stuff. So don't be afraid to do it. And it's going to be absolutely fine. All right. So let's move on to the fourth fundamental topic that I want to talk about here. And progressively, as we talk about this stuff is getting more and more complicated, but also more and more interesting. So here's the thing. I love to talk about this. I suggest everybody learn about reamping and DIs. I think that the skill of really good reamping and working with DIs is fundamental to having a successful home studio, especially a beginner's home studio, because you can achieve ridiculous things with this skill. And I'm talking about it as a skill because it is a skill, there are a lot of problems to creating really good signal flow and gain staging. And that is the thing that I would like to start off this story with. And that is proper gain staging and usage of DI boxes. So if you've never heard of DI boxes, we're talking about direct injection boxes. You can find, yet again, a lot of information on the internet about this, but direct injection boxes are there to match the impedance of your signal. That basically means that you can plug in whatever you want. If you have some kind of old device that you want to record, if you have any kind, absolutely anything, a DI box can actually adapt the impedance from that device so it actually works with your audio interface, so you can record at proper levels, therefore creating a higher quality recording. So that's only one of the things that the DI box does. Another thing the DI box does is create a balanced connection. So you can use balanced cables, you can use longer cables without picking up interference on the way. The third thing, which is one of the main reasons why you need a DI box, and that is to remove the ground loops. So I'm going to say this now, and I'm probably going to say it many, many more times during this video. Never unplug the mains, ground, or earth on any kind of device. You always kill the ground loops on signal level, all right, on the signal path. And for that, you need actual DI boxes. Now, there are a lot of solutions for DIY DI boxes because yes, you can go and buy an active DI box. There are different DI boxes on the market. A lot of them work really, really well. Some are more expensive, some are less expensive. But believe it or not, there are a lot of DIY solutions, especially for passive DI boxes. So you don't need to be an electronics magician. You just need a soldering iron, and you can buy a few components and actually save a lot of money by building improvised transformer-based isolation boxes, which are going to relieve you of hum, which are going to also add some kind of analog magic to your sound. And it is literally going to save you hundreds of dollars, because sometimes when you're recording some stuff, you need a lot of DI boxes. Well, you can buy one active DI box that's doing a lot of the magical stuff that active DI boxes do, but you can also improvise a few DIY DI boxes that are going to solve you the problems that you have. So DIY solutions when it comes to passive DI boxes is an absolute encouragement you get from me, but you can also create active DI boxes through DIY means. And I do suggest you do that, but I'm just mentioning the passive ones first because not everybody likes to create active electronics. People are on different levels when it comes to DIY. There's a lot of information on the Slightly Technical Academy, and I have my course on the Big Muff Pi where I actually talk about this stuff extensively and teach you actually how to create different great audio solutions. So DIY DI boxes are a definite suggestion you explore. Now, reamping. What is reamping? Well, if you had a DI box, it is usually used when you're connecting some kind of device, for example, your keyboard, or in some cases a microphone, depending on the DI box what you're using. A lot of the times, bass guitar, you would connect the bass guitar to your DI box. The DI box would adapt the signal for your audio interface, and from the DI box you connect to your audio interface. You make a very clean, nice connection. You make a very clean, nice recording. Now, reamping is the opposite way. When you want to take a signal out of your audio interface and you want to run it through some kind of, for example, instrument amplifier. It is frequently used for guitar amplifiers. A lot of people do guitar amplifier reamping. It has its own problems, but reamping is one of the best things that you can do in a small home studio, because if you create a reamping kit through DIY means, or if you buy a reamping kit, the reamping kit would just be a DI box, but kind of reversed. It does the opposite thing. You can actually use this in creative ways where you can simulate analog outboard gear with the devices that you already have. A lot of us, we have like guitar pedals. Guitar pedals are fairly cheap, and you can also make guitar pedals, which is something that we're going to be talking about in the next fundamental, but you can reamp stuff through guitar pedals. It doesn't need to be guitar. You can reamp vocals. You can reamp drums, a snare. You can use fuzzes, distortions, compressors. You would be surprised how good guitar pedals sound when reamped, and you can add some additional analog warmth. Well, let's call it analog warmth, but this whole analog magic to your home studio where you don't really have the very expensive outboard gear, the racks, the power supplies, the SSLs, the Neves. You can improvise this stuff with practically guitar pedals, which is ridiculous. And the only thing that you need is a reamp box and a DI box, so a reamping kit. So when it comes to all of these DIY solutions and when it comes to all of these skills that you want to know when you're starting a home studio, I think this is one of the first things that you should do, and that is create a reamping chain, because you will be able to create phenomenal results just by improvising stuff like this. And that brings us to the fifth fundamental that I want to talk about in this particular podcast, and that is the DIY guitar pedal mods. Now, a lot of you who have been following this channel, you know that I do tube amplifier mods, guitar pedal mods, and I design them, I build them. I have built over, I don't really know the number of guitar pedals, how many I've made. All the amplifiers behind me are modded or completely redesigned. I've been working on this stuff for over 10 years. This is so fun. Now, if you have a soldering iron and if you're building your own home studio, hopefully you are going to have a little bit of free time to play around. Now, you don't need to build pedals, even though I do suggest building pedals because it can save you tons of money. Like, it can literally save you tons of money just so you don't have to buy a lot of these overdrive circuits and some compressor circuits. Ridiculous sounds that you can achieve. But you can also learn just to mod them a little bit, because you can, weirdly enough, you can adapt these pedals to sound better with certain pieces of music that you want them to reamp. For example, if you want to use that guitar pedal for drums, and if you find that the guitar pedal is cutting too much bass, well, you can learn just to swap one capacitor in that particular guitar pedal, and it's going to add saturation to your snare drum without, making it thin. For example, if that particular guitar pedal is thin. And that happens a lot, because if it's designed to work well with guitar, it doesn't necessarily have to sound good with a snare, but you can fix it with one capacitor. It is ridiculously simple. The only thing that you need to do is just be interested in that, because you can go out and Google this stuff out. You would be surprised. There is a whole world of DIYers out there that do this stuff, and everything that you need is go buy a capacitor, which is probably, I don't know, 10 cents or something like this, and you can modify your particular pedal to sound the way you want it to sound, basically. Now, I have already mentioned the Big Muff Pi Demystified course, and this is the first course on my Slightly Technical Academy. It is only the first course, and I'm now working on some really, really cool new stuff. But the Big Muff Pi Demystified is ridiculous, because it's like over 14 hours of content talking about a legendary pedal, but not only talking about that pedal, we are actually talking about audio engineering and how you can mod and build different types of pedals. By completing this course, you can actually build pretty much any pedal, and it's the perfect platform to start because I made it for beginners in mind. So we start with the fundamentals. You will learn the fundamentals, and then if you want to build the Big Muff Pi, well, you're going to learn how to build any kind of version, boutique level style of that pedal, but you can also learn and build different types of pedals. So it's a great platform to start off with. So I definitely suggest go check the course out. There are also a lot of goodies for guitar players. So if you're a guitar player, you're going to find Tonex packs and stuff like this, but registration is for free, and you get access to the private Academy backstage server on Discord, where we can actually hang out and you can ask questions, and I can actually give you proper competent support. So fundamental number 6 that I want to talk about is ridiculously important, and that is noise reduction tricks. Now, noise is a problem in absolutely every studio, and especially when you're a beginner, you are going to have a lot of trouble with noise. A lot of people who don't have experience with noise, they would have to pay other people to help them with that noise, or they learn how to live with that noise. But here's the problem. If you want to make pro studio recordings, or even if you don't want to be like a pro, but you want to make something good, something that at least gets close to the recordings that you wish you were making, noise should be at the absolute minimum. Noise is ridiculously important. Whenever you're creating some kind of audio recording, if the noise is low, the recording is going to be better. And I know this sounds weird, but trust me on this. I've been designing tube amplifiers and guitar pedals, and it is my experience that when you keep the noise at the bare minimum, overall the sound that you're going to be getting from that amplifier, from that pedal, is going to be better. And I don't mean this in some kind of audiophile hi-fi way. Yes, there's some old equipment that makes a lot of hiss, for example. And yeah, it sounds great, and a lot of people like this old equipment, but specifically, I'm talking about getting rid of hum, because hum always eats away from the sound. Because just imagine this, you've got this hum, and the hum is eating a portion of the power, making these certain semiconductor devices in your audio device work for no particular reason. It's just working to hum, right? Instead of having this portion, this amount of power that is simply, inherent in that device, and use that portion of the device to amplify your signal or to do whatever it's going to do with your signal, you don't waste it on hum. That's the general idea behind the noise. Now, let's talk about some of the most frequent types of noise that you would have in your home studio, and let's talk about some solutions, all right? So, the first noise that you would have a problem with is the ground loop noise. Now, ground loop noise can be sometimes weird because ground loops manifest themselves in different ways depending on what you are doing and what kind of setup you have. If you get into reamping, you're going to have ridiculous amounts of weird ground loops that you have to solve. That's why you would need like transformer isolation, which is inherent in DI boxes, or some kind of sufficient DI boxes. So understanding how to break these ground loops is fundamental. Now, what are ground loops? And I'm going to give you just a quick run through this. Well, imagine this. You are connecting two systems, and every time you connect something, for example, if you are connecting your guitar, you would see that a guitar cable has a tip and also a sleeve, right? So it has basically two connections. Now, the sleeve is usually connected to ground. It is connected to one part of your guitar electronics, but when you connect it to the amplifier, it is effectively connecting to the ground rail of the amplifier. Now, if that amplifier is then connected to your audio interface through some kind of line out, for example, then you're effectively connecting the ground from your audio interface to the ground of your amplifier and also to the ground of your guitar. And that can create noise. Now, why does it create noise? Well, sometimes ground of certain devices is not at ground potential. It's not at earth potential. It's not at 0 volts. That's why you have these weird things. And not only that, there are a lot of different feedback loops that can happen. So breaking these ground loops is absolutely fundamental, and you do this with transformers, and transformers you find in DI boxes. So ground loops are the first thing that you need to understand what they are and how to remove them so you would get really nice and clean recordings. Now, there are a lot of different issues that you can possibly have in your room, and I would just mention a few of them. For example, having LEDs in your room is a huge problem. And I will tell you, for example, when I work and record videos such as this one, I have some LEDs behind me. And if I want to reamp something, I just can't have the LEDs on. Well, fundamentally, I can have them on, but we're going to talk about how I solved that particular problem. But generally, LEDs have weird drivers, and these drivers have a lot of noise, and this noise is induced into your audio system. So the general idea is that you don't want LEDs around, and you also don't want dimmers. Never have dimmers in your room. That is the worst possible, very obsolete solution to some kind of adjustment for lighting, because these dimmers, they're just going to induce a lot of weird noise. Never use dimmers if you have some kind of home recording studio, all right? So furthermore, you can have problems with like EMI and RFI. So some kind of electromagnetic interference can be present in your room. Sometimes it comes from the outside, which is a huge problem. And sometimes it comes from a device which is in your room. And what you want to do is you want to have stuff shielded. Now, you've probably heard of shielding, and usually shielding is happening on guitars. People shield guitars. Probably you've heard of that. If you haven't, doesn't matter. But stuff needs to be shielded. Now, how do you achieve shielding? Well, shielding is actually super simple. You just want a piece of metal, for example, aluminum or copper. And by the way, there's no difference in aluminum or copper. They both work fine, other than copper is better because you can actually solder onto copper, and you want this piece of metal grounded. You need to connect it to ground. It is great because you can essentially create shielding umbrellas. If you, for example, see that you have a problem with some kind of RFI, EMI, something in your room, you can basically create a bigger piece of some kind of sheet copper or sheet aluminum, and you can connect it to ground and basically put it next to a certain device, and it's going to act as a shield. What does that actually mean? Well, imagine this. If you have an antenna, you would put it on top of your house, and that antenna would be connected to some kind of, amplifier, some kind of electronics that comes after the antenna. But the antenna would be very sensitive. It would pick up stuff from the air, and then it would amplify it. Now, the shield is also going to pick up stuff from the air, but you have to connect it to ground directly, so whatever interference is in the air is not induced into your devices. It is actually thrown away, as we say, to ground directly. That's why a lot of our amplifiers, our audio interfaces, all this stuff has some kind of metal cavity, metal casing. That is because this protects from RFI. But remember, the most important thing when you're trying to shield something is that you need to connect this shield to ground. Now we're coming to something really interesting, because we were talking about essentially electromagnetic radio frequencies here. What can happen is that you can actually have problems with the magnetic field in your room. What am I talking about here? Well, if you have a small room like me, and if you have big amplifiers like me, you will soon realize that when you switch these amplifiers on, when these transformers start conducting current and start actually working, they generate a magnetic field. This magnetic field is quite big, and it's actually picked up by your guitar, because your guitar also have pickups which are magnetic. So you would have a bunch of magnetic fields, which really pose a problem when you want to record something. Now, how do you solve this? Well, the number one trick and number one solution comes from actual amplifier building, and that is to actually position yourself at a 90-degree angle to that magnetic field, if that is possible sometimes. But let me tell you something. If you have a situation with amplifiers, for example, I have a load box for my big tube amplifiers. Sometimes it makes more noise if I turn it like this compared to when I turn it like that. So sometimes if you have something that is problematic in your room and you think it's the magnetic field, try rotating that device at a 90-degree angle, depending on the axis. Just try moving it around and put it in a position where the hum and the noise is the least. That's the same thing with your guitar. Just rotate around and find the position where it's the quietest. That's the only solution to essentially magnetic fields in your room. Now, another solution that is a little bit special, let's call it like that, if you have a long speaker cable. In some cases, for example, yet again, in my room, I cannot explain this, but I had all the possible problems that you can possibly have, and that's why I had to learn all this stuff, right? The whole point is I have a big amplifier, I have a long speaker cable, and then on the other side of the room, I would have my speaker box. Now, here's the thing. If you play really loud and if your cable goes all across your room to the load box, which is potentially on the other side, it's going to carry a lot of current, because if you're blasting through that Marshall, there's going to be current going through that wire. That current is going to generate a magnetic field. That magnetic field is now going to be present all around your room, which is going to pose a lot of problems. Now, what is the solution? Well, the expensive solution would be some kind of magnetic shielding thing for cables. It exists. I've seen that thing exist. It's quite expensive, but a very cheap solution is a metal pipe. And you don't want a copper pipe. You don't want an aluminum pipe, you want a steel pipe. The thicker, the better. And that is going to protect you from the actual magnetic. That's going to minimize the magnetic field that comes around that particular cable. Now, in most cases, you don't need this because this magnetic field is not that big. But this also brings us kind of back to the story of those cables that we were talking about. Sometimes to minimize the noise, you have to pay attention to where you route your cables. Never route signal cables and power cables next to each other. Ideally, it would be the best if you would, kind of cross them at a 90-degree angle, even though that's not very practical in most cases, but always separate the power cables and the actual signal cables, because if you're running something that consumes a lot of current, well, there's going to be a magnetic field, and the magnetic field is going to get induced into your signal. Therefore, you're going to hear hum. So you don't want to do that. And I think the biggest takeaway here is just break these loops. Make sure that these fields are not interfering with your signal cables. Just isolate the signal cables. All right, so now sort of connected to this is the seventh fundamental that I want to talk about here, and these are custom power solutions. Now, disclaimer, if you work with power and you don't know what you're doing, I do not suggest that you do this by yourself, all right, because it can be sort of dangerous. On the other hand, it is not dangerous if you listen to me and simply know what you're doing and practically just disconnect everything from power whenever you're working with that. It is not that complicated. It is not something that you should be afraid of. And when I talk about custom power solutions, that is, you can actually save a lot of money, but making your own power strips. You can make better power strips than the ones that you actually buy, especially the ones that you buy in those typical, how you call them, Walmarts or stuff like that. You don't want to use some random power strip and connect a lot of gear to that power strip for multiple reasons. The main reason would be safety. They can fail. You don't want to use power strips a lot. For example, power strips were completely forbidden on the cruise ship where I worked. And whenever we would see anybody bringing a power strip on the ship, we would immediately take it, because there have been a lot of situations where power strips will catch fire. That is mainly because they are not really reliable, and the wires and the cables actually used to make these power strips are not thick enough. So you can make ones by yourself. You can actually buy finished power strips or actually metal casings for them, and you can then buy cables. You can make thick cables. You can connect this to the power strip. You don't even need a soldering iron for this. You just need a screwdriver. And in addition to that, you can add filters. Now, filters, and specifically I'm talking about XY filters. This is very important because I mentioned the LED strips making a lot of problems. Well, with XY filters, you can actually solve this, because you can create a power strip which has these filters, and then you connect your lights and LEDs to this particular strip, and they will not induce the noise that normally they induce in the system if they're connected to just a regular power strip. Now, furthermore, when it comes to custom power solutions, learning how to build some basic power supplies is actually quite easy. And there are a lot of DIY solutions on the internet, but I do have to say that not always DIY solutions work best, especially in today's day and age. And let me just elaborate on that a little bit. If we were talking about power supplies, for example, for pedal boards, for guitar players, 10, 15 years ago, I would always suggest make your own power supply. I made a bunch of power supplies. I made power supplies for other people. There are different power supply architectures. You can make them sound really good, especially sometimes for audio, you need linear power supplies, and I'll talk about it in a second. But realistically, there are a lot of power supplies today that you can buy, especially for guitar player pedal boards, that are just great. And they don't cost that much money. Back in the day when I was building these power supplies, there was no other solution, because if you wanted to buy a really good power supply, it was really, really pricey and out of reach for me particularly. And I was like, I'm going to build a power supply by myself for like $20, and then I'm going to buy a bunch of pedals instead of buying a $400 power supply. So you get where I'm going with this. Now, I also mentioned linear power supplies. you do have to know what is the difference between switch mode power supplies, sometimes they call them the choppers, and the linear power supplies when it comes to audio. Unfortunately, most of the time, the linear power supplies are going to sound best if they're good, if they're well filtered, of course. Now, that is not to say that switch mode power supplies are not good. No, but there are a lot of bad ones out there. And unfortunately, sometimes, not sometimes, but unfortunately, very frequently, devices that you buy, audio interfaces, stuff that you buy used for audio, they come with very, very cheap, very bad SMPS, and they just don't sound good because they have some high frequency distortions. You can hear some kind of clicking and switching like a computer playing around. That comes from these power supplies, and usually the solution is a linear power supply. When I say a linear power supply, we're talking about a power supply with a transformer, with a rectifier, and some kind of capacitors for filtering, and possibly there should be some kind of regulatory circuit to make the voltage stable, but it's literally like 5 components or something like this. It is very, very simple, but it's very clean and it sounds great. And I definitely suggest, if you are in a part of the world where you can get linear power supplies, get linear power supplies for your home studio. Now, we in Europe, we do have a big problem because there is some kind of law where they don't really let us get like linear power supplies, so you can't actually buy them anywhere. They just don't exist in markets anymore because of some reason. Well, I don't even want to discuss it over here, but basically there is a reason, because they just consume more current when they're idle, so when nothing is connected to them, compared to these switch mode power supplies, and we don't need to talk about that stuff. And before I move on to the last fundamental, I have to say once again, safety first, always safety first. When you're working with power, disconnect the whatever you're working with, the power strips. Pay attention when you're working with the outlets. Just put the breakers down. If you have fuses in your home, just make sure that power is disconnected whenever you work with this stuff. And most importantly, do not, please, never lift the mains earth, all right? Always lift the ground on signal level. Don't just do this. Don't lift the earth on amplifiers. It is a bad idea, trust me. All right, so if we move on to the 8th and last fundamental, and this one is super fun, and this is the one that I saved the most money on, and that is buy used gear. Now, this is obvious, but not all people know how to buy used gear. And I'm not saying this meaning that people can't call a number or send a message. There's different gear, and you kind of need some experience when you're buying used gear, because some used gear is great when bought used, and some gear shouldn't be bought used, if you know what I mean. So let's talk about a few different things. The first thing, for example, microphones. Microphones, if you have a recording studio, microphones are going to be the foundation of your recording studio, because you're listening to me speaking through a microphone. I've never bought a new microphone, especially if we're talking about an SN7B, about an SM57, for example. Just get them used. If they're in a good condition, for sure, you're going to look at them. If they have a scratch, who cares? You just get that microphone if it works well. Now, when buying used microphones, you have to make sure that you're buying the real thing. So also you can address a lot of these issues with the clones and the copies. There's a lot of information on the internet, but also if you buy stuff from people who are reputable in the used gear space, you will not have problems. More often than not, I had very, very successful acquisitions of used gear, and I have saved ridiculous amounts of money. And also, buying gear is a process like hunting. You have to be patient, and you have to have a budget for this kind of adventure, and you just wait for it, because suddenly something's gonna come up on the ads, whether it's Craigslist or Reverb or eBay or something like that, and you hunt it. You have the money ready and you can buy it, because occasionally people sell stuff for a very good price. So I definitely suggest doing that. So if you want to buy, for example, monitors, studio monitors that are used, This is a part that is kind of weird, because if you want to buy NS10s or something that's like old and already, we all know about it, everybody wants to have them, they're quite expensive today. So there are a lot of products today on the market that are actually really good when you buy them new. So you don't always have to hunt for stuff that is used, because sometimes the old NS10s are either overpriced or are in a bad conditions. Either way, you don't want to buy them. There are some solutions today that are perhaps a better solution and a cheaper solution. When it comes to monitors, I would say that in the last 10 years, we got some ridiculously good monitors for a very affordable price. That is something that was completely outrageous, for example, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, pardon me. So there are cheaper monitor solutions that are really, really good enough for the home recording studio, especially for beginners. So sometimes you don't really need to go for monitors used. All right. So if we're talking about some kind of outboard gear, preamps, compressors, well, you're in the luck, because there's a lot of stuff now on the used market that's actually good, but people don't know about it. And because people don't really use rack units anymore, you would be surprised for how cheap you can buy some really, really good sounding gear. But you do have to want it, and you do have to learn about it a little bit, learning about the stuff from the 80s. You would be surprised that a lot of that gear actually works completely fine. You do have to pay attention with gear from those years. Sometimes they would use some obsolete components and they're really hard to repair. So do keep that in mind. Now, when it comes to, for example, buying cables, snakes, and multi-cores, stuff like that, I don't really suggest buying that used, because sometimes you need to test stuff really, really well. If you would buy a multi-core, you want it completely tested. You wanted it to test it by yourself if possible, because chances are you're going to buy a multi-core and half of these cores are actually broken. Somebody, put something really hard on it. So this is really, really tricky. If you want to buy used, I would suggest buying this stuff new or making it by yourself. When it comes to audio interfaces, you should be cautious, because you are buying a piece of digital gear. And I always suggest, whenever you buy digital pieces of gear, buy them either new, or if you buy them used, don't buy, let's just say, older than 2 years used. And this number doesn't have to be fixed, but think about it this way. These digital devices, they get support from the companies that they were designed by. They would get firmware updates. If you buy an old digital device, you would get into the problem of not having very good support, for example, for the new operating systems. That's very common with audio interfaces. So basically, the newer audio interfaces are designed to work better with the new updated operating systems that you're working with. So you either know what you're doing or in buying it used, or just buy something completely new, the newest possible thing that you can buy, because you would be surprised how important the firmware updates and drivers are to the actual operation of that particular device. And that's the same thing that I suggest for processors. When it comes to guitar equipment, I simply think that the new stuff sounds better. It has better support. Yes, there are some exemptions. There are always exemptions. But the general idea is that stuff you want to buy either new or used, relatively new. So do pay attention to that. Now, the takeaway here is that there is a lot of gear that sounds great, a lot of old gear that you can buy used, some of it for great prices, and that gear is going to work and sound great in your home studios, and you can save tons of money just by buying this older stuff. You don't really need to give into all the hype. You don't really need to believe all the people who are telling you that you need these new things. People have been making great, ridiculously great records for years and years and years. And they have been doing it on, well, essentially old gear, which can sometimes be found for not a lot of money. So these were the 8 fundamentals that I selected for this video For sure, there are some other things that you can benefit from and save money on, and we're going to be talking about that in some of the future videos. Now, what I want you to do is write your story down in the comments. What have you benefited the most from? What have you saved money on the most? And please don't forget, go subscribe to the Slightly Technical Academy. You get access to the private backstage Discord server. And if you want to support what I'm doing, please go check out the Big Muff Pie course. You will be happy with that thing. And check out some stuff in the store. That's all fun stuff. And I thank you for watching. I'll be seeing you in the next video.